In that sense, the weakness of the Manhattan case, of the New York State case that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the weakness of that case actually helps Trump politically here and from a PR standpoint, because he can look at it and say, this is just like the other case. So it's actually a gift to him that these indictments came in this order. If this indictment had become first, he'd have a much more difficult time making the argument that this is all politically motivated. That's a witch hunt. That's how weak the Manhattan case is, and he's actually going to be able to use that to his advantage from a political public relations standpoint.
To Mick Mulvaney, former chief of staff to Donald Trump. Good evening to you, Mick.
Carol, good evening from Washington, where I'm actually standing right next to Sean Spicer.
Oh, excellent. Well, well, brilliant. We'll be speaking to him very shortly. But just give me your thoughts, first of all, on what we were hearing there from Alex Soto, just talking about quite how serious these charges are that Donald Trump has faced tonight.
Oh, extraordinarily serious. I think you and I talked several weeks back after Donald Trump was indicted for the first time in Manhattan, in New York City, on the alleged hush money payments to the porn star Stormy Daniels. And I, at that time, told you how unserious I believed those charges were and how politically motivated they appeared to be. This is the exact opposite of that. These charges are extraordinarily serious. They're backed up with a good bit of an introduction of evidence, including evidence that on tape of Donald Trump himself speaking. So this is night and day compared to the previous indictment that we talked about previously.
Of course, we've not actually seen a video feed of what was said in court, although there was, as I understand it, that this was released to some of the reporters who were there. But it's clear that, the charges he faces include obstructing the government's efforts to actually get the papers back. So there's no question here that he somehow just took these classified documents home and forgot to put them back in the right place.
Well, if he had, he would not be in trouble. Keep in mind, he did give back a bunch of documents, and he's not charged with anything related to those documents. So it's not the taking of the documents that is the distinguishing factor here. It's the keeping of the documents. It's also, by the way, how this is different from the investigation to Michael Pence, who was cleared on this. And I expect it will be that current President Biden will be cleared as well, because both of them gave back the documents. Donald Trump is charged with not only retaining these documents, what he should not have, or at least that's the case the federal government is making, but also obstructing the government in trying to do its law enforcement. So obstruction is oftentimes a bigger problem than the underlying crime. Keep in mind, going back to Watergate in the 1970s, it wasn't the break-in that actually got President Nixon in trouble. It was his cover-up that did, and that is very, very often the case in politics, and appears to be here as well.
And what do you make of what we've heard from Donald Trump and his team so far? It's a fairly familiar approach, saying that the whole system is rigged. He's being unfairly targeted by his political opponents. He's written on his Truth Social website about a witch hunt and so on. That is clearly going to be his whole approach to all of this.
It is. And actually, in that sense, the weakness of the Manhattan case, of the New York State case that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the weakness of that case actually helps Trump politically here and from a PR standpoint, because he can look at it and say, this is just like the other case. So it's actually a gift to him that these indictments came in this order. If this indictment had become first, he'd have a much more difficult time making the argument that this is all politically motivated. That's a witch hunt. That's how weak the Manhattan case is, and he's actually going to be able to use that to his advantage from a political public relations standpoint.
But that's not necessarily going to help him when this case comes to court, is it?
But yeah, it might. Keep in mind, it's a jury of your peers. It's going to be 12 folks. And in this country, I don't know what it's like in England. I apologize. A criminal charge has to be unanimous. So all he would have to do is convince one of those 12 people that this is politically motivated. That's not impossible. A hung jury here is entirely possible. Keep in mind, this case is brought in Florida, in South Florida, not in New York City, not in Washington, D.C., not in California. Florida tends to be a little bit more conservative, and the chances of having more pro-Trump leaning jurors is dramatically higher in Miami than it would be, say, in Los Angeles.
So, despite what we're hearing is some quite considerable evidence put by the prosecuting lawyers, as you say, he's got to convince a jury, and he's got to convince a jury. The prosecutors, would have to convince a jury unanimously before he could actually be convicted.
Correct. And they're going to have this hurdle, Carol, that there's no apparent damage here yet. If the only evidence is the evidence that's mentioned in the indictment, then that means that Donald Trump didn't sell this to any foreign government, didn't even discuss it with a foreign government, that no foreign intelligence service got a hold of this document. The only allegations in the indictment are that he showed it to some of his staffers on two different occasions. So the prosecution now will not only have to convince the jurors that Mr. Trump did these things, but that he should go to jail as a former president of the United States for something that apparently had very little, if any, harm on the national interest. That, I think, is going to be the prosecution's biggest challenge if, and this is important, if there isn't additional evidence that we haven't seen yet.
How do you expect this legal process to unfold now? Because clearly this was just an initial brief court appearance.
There'll be various motions. Keep in mind the judge here was appointed by Donald Trump, and there's some discussion about whether or not she should recuse herself, whether she'd be too biased to perform as the judge. There'll be a great deal of fighting, I would expect, over the makeup of the jury. There'll be a great deal of fighting amongst the lawyers I'm talking about now regarding the nature of the evidence. Is the tape recording, for example, allowed into evidence under our system? This could drag out for many, many months. In fact, I've heard some speculation, and I don't think it's baseless, that this trial may not take place until after the election. We do have a right to a speedy trial in this country, but that right is possessed by the accused, not by the government in making the accusations. So if Donald Trump wants to drag this out until after the 2024 election, he might well be able to do that, and that obviously would change the political landscape again.
And that would presumably suit him, wouldn't it? Because he could just continue to say that there is this conspiracy by those that have got it in for him.
Absolutely. The risk that he runs, of course, is he loses in court and he goes to jail, and a Democrat becomes president, and there's no chance of getting him pardoned. If he decides to drop out of the race and help another Republican get elected, or I guess in his own mind get himself elected, maybe he could pardon himself. But again, you're talking now about dealing with some very risky circumstances. About 85% of all federal trials criminal trials now, that go to the jury come back with convictions. So if Donald Trump actually ends up in court in front of a jury of his peers, the odds are that he goes to jail, and that's going to be something that I think is going to keep him up late at night for a while.
How does this affect his prospects of winning the Republican nomination and indeed of winning another term in the White House?
And this is the exact same answer I gave to you every other time he gets charged with something, which is he is now more likely to be the Republican candidate, to win the Republican primary, and now more likely to lose the general election. Could he still lose a Republican primary? Yes, it's possible. Could he still win a general election? Yes, it's possible. But the odds are that he wins the primary and loses the election. Why? Because the Republican primary voters are the ones who are more likely to think this is a witch hunt. They are the folks who decide the winner in a Republican primary. Independent voters, folks who switch back and forth between parties, who don't follow politics very closely, those are the folks more likely to believe that these charges are quite serious. Obviously, they don't think it's as serious as hard Democrat voters, but they could be swayed and they'd be less likely to vote for Trump as a result of this indictment. So put all that together, and you have Donald Trump more likely to become the Republican nominee and then more likely to lose to Joe Biden or another Democrat.
So even if this case were to go ahead and we've got these serious charges, there would not be enough people within the Republican movement who would think, look, we can't have someone facing such serious allegations as this. He's also got the other case that you mentioned over the alleged hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. We've also got looming potential proceedings about interference in the election in Georgia. Despite all of that, there would not be enough people in the Republican Party who would think that perhaps it was time to look for somebody else as their candidate to stand for running for president.
I saw some polling data today that indicated that it was reliable polling data. Of course, polling data is always a little bit iffy these days. That 80% of Republicans don't consider this to be a serious matter. There could be a couple reasons for that. One could be again the precedent of that weakness of that Manhattan case and the fact that Trump has been targeted. He was, impeached twice. He had the Mueller report investigation. He had all sorts of efforts to sort of discredit him politically, and they could look at that and say this is just another example of that type of endeavor. But they also might be looking at the lack of damage and say, do we really want to, is it really fair to charge a president with a crime when he didn't really hurt the country? That could change, Carol, if there is additional evidence out there that this somehow got into the intelligence community. That it's, for example, all we know about the documents is that they contain information about our nuclear programs and our military readiness, abilities, and so forth. If it comes out during the trial that that ended up in China or Iran or North Korea, that could change Republican voters. But you have to have something that even the MAGA voters, even the hardcore Trump voters, sit back and go, wait a second, hold on. He did what? No, that's a bridge too far for me. It's time for me to find somebody else. We're not there yet, but that's the one thing I will look at as we go forward, as to whether or not there's new information that convinces hardcore Trump voters that this is just too much and a bridge too far.
Just finally, we did see, of course, a group of his supporters gathered outside the court today. There was a pretty huge and intensive security operation in place ahead of this case and surrounding it. But he does like to whip up a crowd, doesn't he, Donald Trump? I mean, do you think there is a danger that he does really try to whip up public opinion against, one of the main institutions of the American Constitution, the legal system?
He does. I think that his ability to do that is greatly diminished by January 6th. Yes, he put out a social media request today for everybody to come to Miami, and a couple dozen people showed up. There was more press than there were protesters, and more security than there were press. I think folks who might have otherwise be inclined to show up and protest for Donald Trump learned a valuable lesson on January 6th. And that's that there are protesters from January 6th who are spending many years in jail. And they recognize that as much as they might like Donald Trump, he can't protect them or won't protect them. And why show up to protect Donald, or to sort of lend support to Donald Trump when he won't keep you out of jail? So I don't expect there to be widespread violence. There certainly was nothing approaching violence today. The crowds were all relatively small. And I think Donald Trump's ability to sort of whip up a large crowd like he did on January 6th is behind him at this point.
Mick Mulvaney, former chief of staff to Donald Trump. Really good to speak to you. Thank you so much.